There comes a moment when effort no longer improves anything, not because something failed, but because nothing is missing. This moment does not announce itself with relief or excitement. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticed, when the inner motion to collect, refine, or enhance simply dissolves. Not out of exhaustion, but out of completion. Ibn Arabi did not describe sufficiency as possessing enough. He pointed toward a deeper recognition that what seeks to be added was never absent in the first place. Inner sufficiency is not an achievement. It is a remembering that addition was a misunderstanding. What is usually named as lack is rarely an actual absence. More often, it is a misunderstanding born from how the mind interprets what it encounters. The mind is trained to evaluate by measurement, quantity, intensity, progress, visible gain. When something cannot be weighed, counted, or compared, the mind assumes it is missing. This assumption is not evidence of emptiness. It is evidence of a limited way of seeing. Presence does not announce itself in units. Wholeness does not present a checklist. Because of this, the mind, unable to confirm completeness through familiar tools, labels the situation as incomplete. This is how lack is created, not through deficiency, but through misreading. What already exists is overlooked simply because it does not fit the criteria the mind has learned to trust. From this misreading arises the impulse to add. The seeker begins to accumulate ideas, practices, explanations, identities, and refinements. Each addition feels necessary, not because something is truly absent, but because the mind believes completion must look more complex than simplicity allows. Intensity is mistaken for depth. Effort is confused with truth. Movement becomes proof of sincerity. Ibn Arabi's insight quietly dismantles this pattern. He does not argue against seeking itself. Rather, he questions the assumption that seeking is always responding to absence. Often, the seeker is responding to fragmentation. Reality is perceived in pieces, this here, that there, now incomplete, later fulfilled. Once reality is broken into parts, the mind feels responsible for stitching it back together. In this fragmented view, accumulation feels meaningful. Each added layer appears to bring the seeker closer to wholeness. Yet the more that is added, the more distance is reinforced. Each addition confirms the belief that what is present was insufficient on its own. The original fullness becomes obscured beneath attempts to improve it. The turning point does not come through acquiring something new. It comes through a subtle shift in perception. When perception begins to reunify, when reality is no longer divided into what is here and what should be, the urge to add loses its urgency. The mind does not force this change, it simply exhausts its misinterpretation. Nothing external needs to change for this shift to occur. Circumstances remain the same. Conditions do not suddenly improve. What changes is the reading of the moment. What was once interpreted as lack is now recognized as unacknowledged completeness. The same situation, viewed without fragmentation, reveals itself as sufficient. This recognition is quiet. There is no announcement, no dramatic relief. The seeker does not feel rewarded. In fact, there may be a brief confusion, almost disappointment, because the expected arrival never happens. There is no final piece added, no sensation of crossing a threshold. Instead, there is a simple settling, as if effort gently steps aside. Completion, in this sense, does not arrive from elsewhere. It was never delayed, it was overlooked. The journey does not end because something new has been obtained, but because the assumption that something was missing dissolves. What remains is not a state of perfection, but a state of accuracy. Recognition replaces pursuit, not recognition as a thought or conclusion, but as a direct clarity that no longer requires reinforcement. The impulse to add fades naturally, the way a question fades once it is understood, not answered. but rendered unnecessary. This is why lack is not a condition. Conditions change. This misreading does not. It persists only as long as perception insists on division. When division relaxes, lack collapses on its own, without effort, without correction, without replacement. What remains is not fullness in the dramatic sense, but adequacy without strain. Nothing is missing because nothing was ever separate enough to be missing. Seeking does not exist on its own. It depends on a particular way of seeing. As long as perception divides experience into what is present and what ought to be present, movement feels necessary. The sense of being on the way only arises when reality is split into stages. Without this split, there is nowhere to go. The self continues to seek because it believes it is standing at a distance from what matters. This distance may not be physical or emotional, it is perceptual. The self imagines that truth, meaning, or fulfillment exists somewhere ahead, somewhere refined, somewhere improved. As long as this assumption remains unquestioned, seeking feels responsible and even virtuous. But Ibn Arabi did not describe the inner path as a journey toward something new. He pointed instead to a gradual undoing of imagined separation. The movement is not forward, it is inward and clarifying. What collapses along the way is not reality, but the belief that reality was divided to begin with. The seeker imagines themselves as a traveler because they imagine a destination. This destination may take many forms: clarity, certainty, peace, knowledge, closeness. Yet each form shares the same structure. It exists elsewhere, later, or beyond the current moment. The moment is treated as incomplete, a waiting room rather than a place of truth. As long as this view persists, movement continues, practices are refined, understanding is pursued, experiences are interpreted as steps. Even stillness becomes a method, and surrender becomes a technique. Seeking adapts itself to every insight so long as division remains intact. What ends seeking is not effort, discipline, or exhaustion. It ends when the structure that sustains it quietly dissolves. This dissolution does not occur through thought alone. Conceptual agreement with unity does not stop movement. The mind can accept unity as an idea while continuing to live as if separation were real. The shift occurs when unity is encountered directly, not explained, not concluded, but recognized in experience. This recognition does not arrive with certainty or emotional intensity. Often it feels subtle, almost anticlimactic. What changes is not what is perceived, but how perception holds it. In that moment, the distance between observer and observed softens. The sense of "I am here and meaning is there" loosens. There is no dramatic merging, no loss of identity, no sudden silence. There is simply no longer a reason to move toward what is already inseparable from the moment itself. Seeking loses its fuel because its logic no longer applies. Without distance, direction becomes irrelevant. Without an imagined elsewhere, progress has no reference point. The seeker does not decide to stop. Stopping becomes the only natural response. This ending is not stillness in the ordinary sense. Life continues to move, decisions are made, actions unfold, but the inner push to arrive somewhere else has dissolved. Movement no longer carries the weight of becoming. Ibn Arabi's insight here is precise. The path does not end with arrival because arrival assumes separation. The path ends when the one who was traveling is no longer needed. Not erased, not destroyed, but no longer central. When unity is seen as lived reality rather than intellectual truth, effort reorganizes itself. Action becomes functional instead of aspirational. The future loses its authority over the present. The present no longer needs to justify itself by leading somewhere else. This is why movement ends naturally. Not because life stops, but because completion no longer depends on motion. What remains is sufficiency without stagnation, participation without pursuit. There is no victory in this ending, and no claim to insight. It does not produce certainty or superiority. It produces adequacy, enoughness without measurement. Seeking was never wrong. It was simply responding to a misunderstanding. When that misunderstanding clears, seeking fulfills its purpose by dissolving. What remains does not feel final, it feels accurate. And in that accuracy, nothing needs to be approached. Accumulation often appears as progress, but it can quietly interfere with recognition. The act of adding whether ideas, disciplines, roles, or spiritual descriptions creates the impression that completion depends on what is gathered over time. Each new layer promises depth, yet it also reinforces a subtle belief that what is already present is insufficient on its own. The mind feels secure when it is building. Collecting knowledge, refining methods, and defining identity provide a sense of direction. These additions give the seeker something to hold on to, something that feels measurable. Yet this very structure can delay the moment of recognition because it keeps attention outward focused on what must still be acquired. Ibn Arabi did not oppose knowledge or practice. His concern was quieter and more precise. He pointed to how attachment forms around accumulation. Knowledge becomes a possession. Practice becomes a marker of advancement. Identity becomes proof of arrival. None of these are harmful by nature, but when they are clung to, they reinforce the assumption that something essential is not yet present. This assumption is rarely stated directly. It hides beneath effort. It disguises itself as sincerity. The seeker believes they are moving toward truth, while unknowingly strengthening the idea that truth is distant. The more that is gathered, the more convincing the story of incompleteness becomes. Accumulation also fragments attention. Awareness is spread across what has been learned, what must still be learned, how one compares to others, and how one is perceived. Recognition, however, does not arise from scattered attention. It emerges when awareness is simple enough to see what has always been there. This is why subtraction is necessary, not subtraction of facts, experiences, or understanding, but subtraction of assumption, the assumption that depth increases through quantity, the assumption that identity must be constructed, the assumption that recognition is earned rather than uncovered. Letting go of these assumptions does not mean forgetting what has been learned. It means no longer using what has been learned as evidence of worth or progress. Knowledge returns to its proper place, as a tool, not a foundation. When accumulation loosens its grip, attention begins to turn inward, not inward as a technique, but inward as a natural settling. Awareness no longer leans toward future improvement or past achievement. It rests with what is already functioning, already sufficient, already complete in its own way. In this resting, something unexpected is noticed. Nothing essential is missing. The sense of absence that drove accumulation is revealed as a habit of interpretation rather than a reality. What felt incomplete was never lacking. It was simply obscured by the noise of addition. Recognition does not arrive as a conclusion. It is not the result of having gathered enough. It is more like a clearing, where effort steps aside and perception becomes direct. There is no feeling of accomplishment, only a quiet understanding that nothing needs to be secured. This can feel unsettling at first. The structures that once provided meaning lose their urgency. The seeker may feel exposed without markers or milestones. Yet this exposure is not emptiness. It is clarity without decoration. Ibn Arabi's subtle warning is not against learning or growth, but against mistaking accumulation for realization. Growth continues, but it no longer defines the self. Learning continues, but it no longer delays recognition. When awareness is no longer busy maintaining an image of progress, it recognizes its own sufficiency, not as a claim, not as pride, but as an undeniable simplicity. There is nothing absent because nothing essential was ever added. What remains is not a stripped-down version of the self, but a self no longer burdened by proof. Action continues, understanding deepens, life unfolds, but without the constant pressure to complete something that was never incomplete. This is how accumulation gives way to recognition, not through rejection, but through release. Inner sufficiency rarely announces itself in a way the mind expects. It does not arrive with intensity, clarity, or a sense of achievement. There is no internal shift that feels elevated or extraordinary. In fact, when sufficiency first appears, it can feel almost underwhelming. Nothing seems to have improved. Nothing feels enhanced. Life looks the same as it did before. This ordinariness is precisely why it is missed. The mind has been trained to associate truth with intensity and meaning with contrast. It expects completion to feel different from everyday experience. It anticipates certainty, emotional relief, or a lasting sense of peace that can be clearly identified. When these signs do not appear, the mind assumes nothing meaningful has occurred. Ibn Arabi's insight moves in the opposite direction of expectation. He pointed toward a form of completion that does not stand apart from life, but settles directly into it. Sufficiency does not elevate experience above the ordinary. It removes the pressure that demanded experience be more than it is. The mind often believes that what matters must feel important. It searches for markers, calm that never wavers, confidence that does not doubt, clarity that does not blur. When inner sufficiency does not match these expectations, it is dismissed as insignificant or incomplete. The seeker continues searching, unaware that the search itself has already lost its necessity. What actually changes is subtle. There is no surge of understanding or sense of arrival. Instead, something quietly relaxes. The constant inner leaning toward improvement softens. The urge to refine, correct, or advance no longer drives perception. This relaxation is not dramatic enough to be celebrated, which is why it is often ignored. Inner sufficiency does not produce excitement. It produces ease, not the ease of comfort, but the ease of no longer needing to justify the present moment. Life continues with its imperfections, uncertainties, and movement, but the inner pressure to fix or surpass it fades. This fading is not noticed immediately because the mind is accustomed to motion. Improvement has been its language. Goals have been its orientation. When that language stops being spoken internally, there is a brief silence that can feel confusing rather than fulfilling. The mind may interpret this as stagnation or loss of motivation. Yet nothing has been lost. What has disappeared is urgency. The constant sense that something must be added, achieved, or resolved in order for the moment to be acceptable quietly dissolves. This dissolution does not feel special. It feels normal, so normal that it can be mistaken for indifference. Ibn Arabi did not describe sufficiency as a peak state. He described it as alignment. When alignment occurs, effort becomes unnecessary, not because effort is forbidden, but because it is no longer required to secure meaning. Action still happens, but it is no longer driven by the fear of incompleteness. Nothing dramatic happens because nothing needs to be announced. The absence of internal pressure does not demand recognition. It does not ask to be named or protected. It simply functions. Life moves forward without the constant commentary of improvement. This is why inner sufficiency can feel disappointing at first. The seeker expects confirmation. They expect a sense of, "This is it." Instead, they encounter a quiet continuity. The day continues. Thoughts arise and pass. Responsibilities remain. The world does not pause to acknowledge anything. And yet, beneath this continuity, something essential has changed. The inner narrative that once demanded progress has lost its authority. The mind may still suggest improvement, but it no longer feels compulsory. There is space between suggestion and identity. This space is subtle but decisive. It allows life to be lived without constant self-evaluation. Choices are made without the pressure to become someone else through them. Success and failure lose their exaggerated importance. They return to their practical roles rather than defining worth. The sign of sufficiency is not happiness, clarity, or confidence. It is the absence of strain, not physical strain, but existential strain. The quiet understanding that nothing essential depends on becoming different from what one already is. This understanding does not feel like wisdom. It feels like relief without celebration. There is no sense of superiority, no claim to insight. There is simply less inner noise demanding correction. Ibn Arabi's subtlety lies here. He did not point toward experiences that feel special. He pointed toward the end of the need for experiences to feel special at all. Completion does not shine, it settles. And in that settling, urgency disappears. Not because life has been solved, but because life no longer needs to be justified through effort. The absence of urgency is not emptiness. It is sufficiency functioning quietly, without asking to be noticed. This is why it is so often overlooked. And this is why, once seen, it does not ask to be held. The idea of improvement carries an assumption that quietly shapes perception. To improve something means it is lacking in its current form. This assumption often goes unnoticed because improvement is praised, encouraged, and treated as responsible behavior. Yet beneath the surface, it reinforces the belief that what exists now is not enough to stand on its own. When this belief is no longer held, effort changes its nature. It does not disappear, but it loses its urgency. Clarity begins to replace striving, not because answers suddenly appear, but because the pressure to correct reality dissolves. The mind no longer approaches life as a problem that must be refined into acceptability. Clarity, in this sense, is not an accumulation of insight. It is not the result of understanding more concepts, forming stronger conclusions, or arriving at definitive explanations. Ibn Arabi pointed toward a quieter clarity, one that emerges when resistance softens, when the inner need to shape, polish, and perfect identity relaxes, perception naturally sharpens. Much of mental strain comes from refinement. The self is constantly being adjusted, evaluated, and improved in response to imagined standards. This refinement creates friction. Every choice carries weight. Every action feels like a test of correctness. Even rest becomes conditional, allowed only after improvement has been earned. When the assumption of deficiency fades, this friction loosens. Life continues as before, but without constant inner negotiation. Tasks are done because they are appropriate, not because they enhance worth. Decisions arise without the background tension of self-correction. There is movement, but no pressure to justify it. Clarity does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with certainty or confidence. It shows itself through ease of perception. Situations are seen more simply. What requires action is recognized without debate. What does not require action is left alone without guilt. This clarity is not passive, it is precise. Without the need to improve identity, attention becomes available to reality as it is. Listening deepens, seeing becomes accurate. Responses align naturally with circumstances rather than ideals. Ibn Arabi's insight reframes clarity as the absence of inner interference. When the self is no longer busy reshaping itself, perception functions without distortion. The mind no longer needs to force understanding. Understanding happens quietly in proportion to what is needed. Life does not become perfect in this state. Challenges remain, uncertainty remains. Outcomes are not guaranteed. What changes is the relationship to these elements. They are no longer interpreted as signs of failure or deficiency. They are simply part of movement. Choices feel lighter because they are no longer burdened with self-definition. A decision does not need to prove intelligence, growth, or spiritual maturity. It only needs to be appropriate to the moment. This removes tension from action and allows responsiveness instead of hesitation. Nothing has been perfected because perfection was never the goal. The need for perfection belonged to the assumption that something essential was missing. When that assumption dissolves, perfection loses relevance. What matters is alignment, not refinement. This is why nothing feels incomplete. Not because everything is resolved, but because resolution is no longer required for sufficiency. The present moment does not need to become something else to be valid. Clarity remains because it is no longer being chased. Effort remains where it belongs in action, not in identity. Awareness becomes stable without becoming rigid. It adapts without strain. Ibn Arabi's subtlety lies here. He did not promise clarity as a reward for improvement. He pointed toward clarity as what remains when improvement is no longer used to justify existence. When resistance fades, clarity is not created. It is revealed. Life continues, not elevated, not diminished, simply unobstructed. And in that unobstructed movement, nothing needs to be fixed for clarity to remain. Comparison survives only where ranking is assumed. The moment the mind believes that reality is arranged in levels higher and lower, advanced and behind, complete and incomplete, it begins to measure itself against others. This measurement is rarely conscious. It operates quietly, shaping how worth, progress, and meaning are interpreted. Comparison feeds on imagined hierarchy. Someone appears further along. Someone seems to know more. Someone looks calmer, wiser, more established. The mind translates these appearances into distance and then assigns itself a position somewhere below or above. From this positioning arises tension, ambition, insecurity, or pride. All of it depends on the belief that fullness can be placed on a scale. Inner sufficiency dismantles this structure at its foundation. When sufficiency is present, there is no internal reference point that requires ranking. Fullness does not appear greater or lesser. It does not increase or decrease through comparison. Without an internal sense of lack, the mind has no reason to locate itself relative to others. This does not happen through effort. One does not decide to stop comparing. Comparison loses relevance when the assumption that fuels it dissolves. If nothing essential is missing, then no one possesses more of what matters. If nothing essential can be accumulated, then no one is ahead in a meaningful way. Ibn Arabi's vision leaves no space for spiritual competition because competition requires scarcity. Something must be limited for it to be won. Completion, as he pointed toward it, is not scarce. It cannot be owned, displayed, or demonstrated. It does not belong to individuals as an achievement. It is not distributed unevenly. Because completion has no measure, it cannot be compared. Measurement requires units, stages, or degrees. Completion has none of these. It does not arrive gradually. It is not intensified through effort. It does not grow larger with time. It is either overlooked or recognized, and recognition does not create superiority. This recognition does not make others irrelevant. It removes the need to evaluate them through the lens of progress. Others are no longer examples to emulate or surpass. They are simply expressions of life unfolding according to their own conditions. Without comparison, interaction changes. Conversation loses its hidden competitiveness. Listening deepens because there is no need to extract value for oneself. Appreciation becomes natural because it is no longer threatening. Differences are seen without hierarchy. Similarities are seen without attachment. Inner sufficiency does not flatten individuality. It removes the pressure to define identity through position. A person may still have skill, knowledge, or experience, but these qualities no longer serve as evidence of worth. They become functional rather than symbolic. This shift can feel unfamiliar. Comparison has long provided orientation. Without it, the mind may briefly feel ungrounded, unsure how to evaluate itself. Yet this uncertainty is not a loss. It is a release from constant self-placement. What remains is a quiet equality, not an equality imposed by belief, but an equality revealed by sufficiency. Equality not as sameness, but as shared completeness. No one needs to be elevated or diminished for this to be true. Ibn Arabi did not suggest that everyone is the same in form or function. He pointed toward a deeper parity, that existence itself does not rank its expressions by value. Differences exist without hierarchy. Variation exists without competition. When this is seen, comparison ends not through discipline, but through irrelevance. The mind no longer asks, "Where do I stand?" because standing implies a scale. The scale dissolves when fullness is not ranked. This does not produce indifference. It produces respect without distance. Others are met as they are, without internal positioning. One no longer needs to feel ahead or behind in order to feel valid. Quiet equality is not an idea to adopt. It is what remains when sufficiency settles. It does not announce itself. It does not require agreement. It simply functions as a way of seeing. Life continues with difference, diversity, and movement. Yet beneath these variations, there is no competition for completion. Nothing essential is being distributed unevenly. In this way, sufficiency ends comparison at its root, not by correcting the habit, but by removing the belief that made the habit necessary. What remains is a simple coexistence with existence itself, unranked and undivided. When adding comes to an end, life does not retreat inward. It steps forward with greater accuracy. Completion does not create distance from the world. It removes the confusion that once distorted engagement with it. What changes is not participation, but the reason for participating. Before sufficiency is recognized, action is often driven by proof. One acts to confirm worth, direction, sincerity, or growth. Effort becomes a signal, not just a response. Even helpful actions can carry hidden agendas. To be seen, to feel necessary, to justify one's place in the world. Movement is mixed with self-definition. When nothing needs to be added, this mixture dissolves. Action is no longer required to build identity or secure meaning. What remains is integrity, not as a moral stance, but as alignment between perception and response. Action arises because it fits, not because it advances a story about the self. This shift brings precision. Without the need to display effort, excess falls away. Without the need to impress, gestures become simple. Without the need for validation, doing becomes quiet. The same actions may still occur, but their weight changes. They are no longer carrying the burden of becoming. Ibn Arabi's understanding of sufficiency does not describe a passive state. It describes exactness. When inner noise quiets, awareness sharpens. One sees more clearly what is required and what is not. Action is no longer scattered across unnecessary efforts. It concentrates naturally where it belongs. This exactness does not come from control. It comes from the absence of distortion. Ambition often bends action away from what is appropriate toward what is impressive. Fear bends it toward what feels safe. Sufficiency removes both pressures. What remains is response without exaggeration. Life continues to present demands. Responsibilities do not disappear. Choices still carry consequences. The difference is that these are no longer interpreted as tests of identity. Responsibility becomes situational rather than personal. One responds because the moment calls for response, not because something must be proven through it. This kind of responsibility is lighter, but not weaker. It does not rely on enthusiasm or motivation. It does not require constant reinforcement. It functions quietly, consistently, and without drama. There is no internal negotiation about whether one should act to maintain an image. When adding stops, clarity about limits also appears. Not everything requires engagement. Not every opportunity needs to be accepted. Not every problem demands ownership. Integrity includes knowing where action ends. This restraint is not withdrawal, it is accuracy. Ibn Arabi's Sufficiency does not decorate life with spiritual meaning. It does not turn ordinary tasks into symbols. It allows tasks to remain what they are. Washing, speaking, working, resting, each occurs without the need to elevate it into something else. Participation becomes direct. Because nothing is being proven, responsibility is no longer heavy. It does not come with self-judgment. Mistakes do not threaten identity. Success does not inflate it. Both return to their proper scale, practical outcomes within a moving life. This natural responsibility is steady. It does not depend on mood or recognition. It does not need to be witnessed. One does what is necessary even when no one is watching, and refrains when action would be unnecessary, even if action would be praised. Such responsibility can appear unremarkable from the outside. It does not announce itself. It does not claim moral high ground. Yet it carries a quiet reliability. Others sense it without being told. Trust forms without effort. Completion, in this sense, does not close life. It opens it to precise participation. One is no longer distracted by the question of who they are becoming. Attention is freed for what is actually present. When nothing needs to be added, time is no longer used to accumulate meaning. It is used to meet situations as they arise. This meeting is not rushed, and it is not delayed. It is proportionate. Ibn Arabi's insight here is subtle but firm. Sufficiency does not remove responsibility. It removes distortion. Action becomes honest because it is no longer filtered through ambition or fear. Responsibility becomes natural because it is no longer entangled with self-construction. What remains is a life that responds without noise, participation without performance, effort without excess. When adding stops, integrity begins not as a rule to follow, but as a condition that reveals itself when nothing else is being built. When nothing needs to be added, nothing needs to be defended. Life is no longer approached as something unfinished, and the self is no longer treated as a project. What remains is a quiet participation that does not seek confirmation. Completion does not announce itself as an ending. It appears as a change in how movement occurs. Effort loses its urgency, comparison loses its relevance, and action finds its proper scale. Nothing is forced, and nothing is withheld. This sufficiency does not withdraw from the world. It meets the world without distortion. Responsibility becomes simple because it is no longer burdened by ambition or fear. Clarity remains because resistance has softened. What unfolds next is not a destination, but a way of being present without the need to arrive. Life continues, unchanged in form, yet no longer questioned at its core. And in that quiet adequacy, nothing more is required.